All right. Well, thanks so much for coming today, everyone. Thanks so much for everyone who is joining us virtually through our webinar, who may be listening to the recording afterwards, and of course to everyone who has shown up in person. It is really nice to be here and to actually see people's faces and to not be speaking to an empty room. So thank you for your presence. Before we get too deep into things, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Gabriel Enxuga. I use he and they pronouns, and I will be hosting our discussion for tonight. So a little bit about me. I am a social worker and also a co-founder of an organization called Lambda Health, which is a 2S LGBTQ focused mental health cooperative. So we offer telecounseling. Hey, come on in, join us, welcome. Yeah, so I work with Lambda Health. We're a 2S LGBTQ focused mental health cooperative. We offer telecounseling to folks mostly living in Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario, but a couple of our practitioners also operate in other provinces as well. And I'm really excited about the panel tonight because I'm really interested in gender affirming care. My interest in this topic comes first and foremost from my own lived experiences as a queer and trans person, as someone who has accessed gender affirming care here in Nova Scotia, and also through my professional experiences as well, working with community organizations such as the Youth Project, and through my work as a social worker with Lambda Health, supporting other people who are also navigating these systems, seeing the barriers and wanting to spend time with other folks, talking and thinking and dreaming about, how can we provide the care that our communities really need. So part of my MSW, my Master of Social Work thesis research was actually around researching the experiences of accessing gender affirming hormones here in Nova Scotia. And not to get too much into it now, and I'm sure we're going to talk about lots of it tonight, but just even, talking with people and really hearing about a lot of the barriers that people experience. So have difficulty finding competent providers, long wait times, lack of access in rural communities, and beyond that, also just people interacting with healthcare providers and with systems that invalidated their own knowledge of who they were as people. And so I really want to ground our conversation in that while we're talking about what's happening with gender affirming care here in Nova Scotia, for us to really keep in our mind, how do we create systems that truly care for people, that really affirm and validate and support who people are as a whole person. So I'm very, very excited for our panel tonight, very excited for the panelists, and really looking forward to participation from the audience as well. So before we go any further, I do want to open with a land acknowledgement. So here today in our physical location, we are located in Mi'kmaq, which is the ancestral and unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. This land is governed by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which were first signed in 1726, and the treaties did not surrender land to the British Crown, but instead reaffirmed Mi'kmaq and Wolaseet title to the land, and also created rules of which we are to act in peace and friendship to the land and to each other. In addition to that, I also want to recognize the 400+ year history of African Nova Scotian people and other peoples of African descent here in Nova Scotia or Mi'kmaq. As loyalists, refugees, and Maroons, people of African descent came to these lands, built families, cultures, and traditions that continue to shape this place today. And in particular, in this land acknowledgement, recognizing the historic and ongoing contributions of Mi'kmaq, African Nova Scotian peoples. In talking about gender affirming care, I think it's also really important for us to understand the medicalization of trans experience. So talking about the ways in which trans people interact with the medical system as also being rooted in a colonial project, right? So we can't think about people transitioning from one binary gender to another if we don't already have this idea of a gender binary system, and that is rooted in a Eurocentric worldview. So we have to understand the historical context of slavery and colonialism as not only attacking, Black and Indigenous people who may today identify as trans or two-spirit or with other terminology, that also traditional understandings of gender and sexuality were repressed. And at the same time, it has been Black and Indigenous communities and other racialized communities who have been at the forefront of fighting for queer and trans liberation. And so we need to keep this in mind also as we're having this conversation. So a couple housekeeping things for the panel tonight. So this event is going to go from 7 to 9 p.m. We have 3 lovely panelists. We have 5 questions, so the panelists are probably going to talk for about an hour, maybe more, maybe less, depending on how chatty we get. But there will be about a half an hour left at the end for questions. We have a Google form for people to submit questions. So this is available on our Twitter, and I think maybe also in the link in the webinar, in the chat box. We'll also, so check the social media. So if you want to submit a question, we ask folks to submit it there. We're not going to be taking questions through the chat box in the webinar. And of course, for people who are here in person, you can raise your hand and you can take the questions that way as well. So we'll do a hybrid. We also have live ASL interpretation that is being facilitated through the webinar. If there's someone here in the audience who would also like ASL interpretation, we have our tech support person and we can set it up so that the webinar is being live streamed and that is also available. We would like to thank our lovely interpreters, May and Jillian, for being with us today. Even though we can't see you, we appreciate you. We want to thank CVRC for their generous support in providing the ASL interpretation and also hosting our webinar. We'd like to thank MSVU for giving us this space tonight, as well as the AV equipment. We definitely didn't pay for that. And we'd also like to thank Carson, who is running the show behind the scenes, moderating the stream, and is going to be reviewing the questions that are submitted tonight. So a lot of people took part in making this happen. All right, so gender affirming care. So what are we talking about when we talk about gender affirming care? So this refers to a broad range of medical, social, and other legal and psychological interventions that are taken to affirm a person's gender identity or expression. So often when we think about gender affirming care, we can think about medical interventions, so things like hormones and surgeries. But I also want to highlight that there are beyond hormones and surgeries, gender affirming care can also include other interventions like speech therapy, hair removal, binding, tucking, gender affirming counseling and support. So when we're thinking about gender affirming care, we can think also just kind of beyond these medical interventions, but like what are all the systems around to support a person in living in the world in the ways that feel good for them. So we want to have a broad conversation. So to do this, we have 3 panelists that I am very excited to introduce. So sitting next to me is Riley Nielson-Baker. They are a public servant and a student of public policy and governance. They have a bachelor's of public management from Florida Atlantic University and a master of public administration from Dalhousie. And they are also currently a master's student in political science at Dalhousie. Their research interests include transgender people in Canadian law, the rural-urban divide, and anti-oppression efforts in the public sector. Riley works in the field of gender-based violence as a program coordinator, providing support for survivors grounded in trauma-informed and whole of community practices. And they are a recipient of the 2021 Roselle Green Award for Public Administration Excellence from Dalhousie. Thanks, Riley. Sitting next to Riley, we have Vincent Mousseau. They are a Black, queer, and trans community organizer and activist based in Shabuktuk. They are a registered social worker with Lambda Health and a Vanier scholar and PhD student at Dalhousie University, studying the ways that anti-Black homophobia acts as a barrier to accessing health and social services for Black and queer and trans men and masculine-centered non-binary people in Canada. As Franco-Ontarian, they are also passionate about providing adapted social services to 2S LGBTQ+ francophones living in minority language contexts, and actually did an interview about that this morning.
Early this morning.
Early this morning. In their free time, they play on a queer dodgeball league and love spending time in coffee shops and with a good book. So, happy to have you here, Vincent. And finally, we have down at the end of the table, we have Abbey Ferguson. So she is a Mount St. Vincent University Women's Studies Honors alumni. She wrote her thesis on the historical applications of the theory of erotic capital, which sounds fascinating. She is currently the executive director of the Halifax Sexual Health Centre and was both the health promotion coordinator and medical office administrator since 2016. She is also a certified abortion doula. In her free time, she plays competitive roller derby at the international level. When teaching sex ed to youth, her favorite question to ask is how to feel the cervix. Love that.
Feels like the tip of your nose.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much, Riley and Vincent and Abbey, for joining us today. So our first question, really just getting a lay of the land, is what is the current state of gender affirming care in Nova Scotia, and what are the most recent developments that we should know about?
I could grab that one because you've probably seen my face a lot in the news if you've been paying attention regarding gender affirming care, because we put out a press release through the Halifax Sexual Health Centre. So I actually had a prepared statement that I was going to do at a flag raising this morning, so I'll just do it now. So 2 weeks ago, we released a press release regarding some unfortunate news regarding gender affirming care access. A singular public provider of gender affirming surgery in Nova Scotia, Dr. Morris, was no longer going to be offering surgical services. And that same day, we were informed that a specialist letter writer, which is a requirement to get surgery approved for public funding from MSI, was no longer going to be accepting new referrals. So the seriousness of those roadblocks prompted us to make that release. I do have positive updates on both of those things, so that is nice to be able to share. So happy to report that we have had a meeting with the plastic surgery department in Halifax, and they have a team of 5 surgeons that are going to be covering those waiting for surgery from Dr. Morris's list over the next year or so. They met with us quickly and also put an administrative process in place really quickly so we can get those referrals moving along. And then they have some really promising medium and long-term goals. Of course, I'm not in the plastics department, so I can't speak specifically to it, but what they were telling us sounds really exciting about getting a gender affirming surgery team lead for the province. So that's kind of exciting, but we do know that there are going to be surgeries continuing to happen, but it's a bit of an ad hoc coverage situation. The specialist letter writer will continue to accept new referrals, so that's fabulous. But we are still calling on MSI to remove that requirement altogether. The person who was not going to be taking anymore is one of the only specialist letter writers in the province, so that's one basket for many, many eggs, which is not a great idea. It's also, that letter is nothing but a checkbox for MSI. Endocrinologists and psychiatrists and other specialists totally removed from the surgical process is a bizarre and arduous step. But for the time being, things can still function. So that's the update there. They're positive, but not radical changes.
That's great.
Well, I can talk a little bit as well about the state of gender affirming care in this province, and it's not a great outlook. It hasn't been a great outlook since it was originally brought into this province 10 years ago. It was a system designed to arguably fail in its provision of services, and we're seeing that failure now, both in the recent developments of people, one person leaves the system and the entire system essentially collapsed for a huge sector of the trans community here in Nova Scotia. But it was also designed to fail socially. It was never really meant to support us. It was meant to essentially check a political box and not actually listen to the community and adapt as our understanding of gender affirming care, even at the time, has shifted and changed. It's a system that relies on a past of medicalizing us and treating us as people who have a severe mental illness that needs to be treated, preferably in their eyes through conversion therapy, which is thankfully no longer legal in this country. But that we are people who need to be protected from ourselves, that we don't know what's right for our bodies, we don't know what's right for us socially. And because of this reality, we're failing members of our community. And to be frank, the government is lucky that it's been allowed to exist in this way as long as it has, and that more substantial challenges like what we're doing here today, like what is happening in government right now, and legally with charter challenges. Government is very lucky that it hasn't gotten to the point where they are forced, and that we're allowing them this opportunity to address these changes by doing the work for them, by doing the research and the consultations for them. Recognizing that reality, that's a good place to start. It's just recognizing that this is grounded in a colonial past, in a past of systemic hatred for trans people and the medicalization of our existence. And only from there can we then move forward to start addressing the actual ways that our system fails us.
Thank you, Riley.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great transition point to what I wanted to touch on, which is specifically around the let's be clear, I'm a clinician in this work, and so I'm seeing the front lines of this, and what I'm noticing in this is that we really cannot ignore, and I think our current government in Nova Scotia is very guilty of this, creating a dichotomy between mental health and physical health. We saw the splitting of the Department of Mental Health or this siloing of mental health and addictions into one portfolio and physical health into the other. And what we know is that all of these things affect each other. And when we see, for example, the way that trans and non-binary people's identities are simultaneously siloed into this idea of mental health, and specifically problematized as a mental health issue, but then simultaneously also requiring physical health intervention, we create barriers. And these are the kinds of things that are happening, first of all, when there are very few trans and non-binary folks in government in the first place, none of whom are in Nova Scotia or in the governing party right now, which in a majority government, what does that mean, right? I also think that we really need to consider the political climate in which we're existing, where right-wing attacks on to us LGBTQ plus folks more generally, but on trans and non-binary people very specifically, are targeting people, and that is having massive ramifications on folks' mental health. And this is, I think, really something that we need to be considering as well as an increased barrier to access, because when you're dealing with mental health issues, you maybe don't have the capacity to start jumping through all the loopholes that our government is already putting into place, and in some cases aggravating through their behavior. And so when we see these kinds of news things coming out around all of the, don't say gay bills in Florida and all of these and all of the really negative stuff that's coming off of Turtle Island right now as a result of these horribly regressive policies, and we're seeing one service provider in the province leaving and basically the entire system collapsing. What faith does that give you in wanting to access that system? And it has multiple ramifications. It encourages folks to turn towards the private sector. I mean, how many folks do we know that have just been like, you know what, to hell with it, I'm either going to go to the United States or I'm going to go to Ontario and see Dr. McLean in Toronto and go there instead, because I know that the wait lists are going to be shorter and the requirements are not as intense. And who is doing this? Trans folks, who are much more likely to live in situations of financial precarity, folks who are going into debt for life-saving care. This is a collective failure of our healthcare systems and our social care systems, for that matter, that this is the case. And so I think when we're talking about all of these, I know the question was specifically about Nova Scotia, but it's very challenging to limit it to that, because we exist in this increasingly connected world that has all sorts of ramifications on our mental and therefore physical health that are just not being addressed meaningfully.
And it even goes a step further from the standpoint that we talk about the siloization of physical health and mental health. Part of the problem with the entire trans experience is that it's been medicalized in every single step. You can't access, in most cases, transitionary care in the form of changing your license marker or your legal name on any of your documents unless you have access to psychological care and have been approved for WPATH. Some of these situations you even look, and I know we are talking specifically about Nova Scotia, you look in the UK where there's gender confirmation certificates where you physically cannot get access or change your identity markers or name on your documents until you have the surgery. It goes further in that our entire experience is, even in transitionary care, is shunted only into surgical procedures, which is only 50% of the trans experience, and ignores the whole other plethora of healthcare needs that we have that aren't being met in this province or realistically anywhere unless you want to head into the private sector.
How many folks have been denied? I mean, again, I just moved from Quebec recently, so I'm much more familiar with that system, but I know about trans guys going to get Pap tests and being refused because their documents say M and the system will not allow it to bill.
That's the case in Nova Scotia. You have to put in exceptional circumstance code. Yeah.
It's absurd, right? And so, and all of these policies, which essentially end up outing people consistently in these ways, which for many people, psychologically speaking, can act as a barrier to access. People are just I don't want to do that, and if I have a choice not to do this, I'm going to avoid it.
You can even take it a step further, and whenever I'm having conversations with people about either gender affirming care generally or GACNS, I always use the example of the emergency room. If a trans person was to get in an accident today, a severe accident, and had to be rushed either to QE2 or Cobequid or Dartmouth, is there a guarantee that the person who's overseeing their care, whether they be any level of healthcare practitioner, is going to know, say, how testosterone or puberty blockers affect the intake of medications that they are treating? Are they going to know the potential risks of providing specific kinds of care? Are they going to know how to actually speak to the person? This goes so much deeper than just, are there people here who can refer people to surgeries and then provide surgeries? It's, if I enter a medical situation, is my existence going to be respected? And is the person who is providing me healthcare actually going to know how to practice healthcare on my body or the body of someone else?
Yeah, absolutely. You're all bringing up such amazing points, talking about the history of where gender affirming care comes from, the context of medicalization, the mind-body dichotomy, which we know is a false dichotomy, talking about the current state of gender affirming care, and also not only about gender affirming care, but just interactions that trans, non-binary, gender diverse, two-spirit people have within the medical system as well. And this goes in because I wanted to talk, we're talking about gender affirming care and what currently exists, but we also know that different people have different experiences accessing those systems. And so I'm wondering, for you folks, if you can speak to that, there are things that we should consider when we're thinking about access to gender affirming care for marginalized communities, right? So thinking about people who are Black, Indigenous, racialized, as well as people who might be low income or living in rural communities. What are the different factors that we need to take in mind when we're thinking about these systems?
Well, I don't mind touching on issues of the rural-urban divide in income, because that's kind of where my focus is in my everyday life. And we need to recognize that as much as there is a gender affirming care crisis in Nova Scotia, we here in Halifax are relatively fine. As soon as you go outside of the city, even still in HRM, but outside of the city, the ability to access gender affirming care, and I don't just mean surgical care or referral care, but that is definitely part of it, but the likelihood that you are going to find a doctor that knows anything about trans people is next to none. The majority of people who live in rural contexts have to travel at least 2 hours in order to be able to access a doctor or healthcare practitioner who can provide them trans, intersex, and gender diverse affirming healthcare. And that's terrifying, and it is part of the greater crisis of healthcare in this province generally, but while it's exacerbated by the lack of funding generally in healthcare in Nova Scotia, it was always like this for us. Not much has changed. Our underfunding has existed since this program has started. And we have to reflect on that reality, because I always have people ask me, well, what about healthcare for everyone else? I'm like, well, yes, absolutely. But you also have to recognize that we never had it. While you're complaining about having reduced access, we never had access, especially those living in rural communities. We also look at income issues. You mentioned earlier that people are going into debt. And we have to recognize that under our current system of gender affirming care in Nova Scotia, essentially only 5 procedures are covered, and they're not covered for anyone. Even as typically the one that you always hear about is a trans woman or trans feminine person trying to access breast augmentation. And most people don't realize that the majority of trans feminine and trans women can't access that if they have the breast development of a 12-year-old child, which is not reflective of, one, an adult's body, or two, the actual needs of that person, and whether we've actually addressed their dysphoria and potentially created euphoria. Because of that system that either doesn't provide, again, very limited care, and even it's limited further to who will actually get approved, and when we talk about issues of gatekeeping and binarism, people are deciding that the procedures that aren't covered either because they weren't approved or it's just not covered period in any circumstances under MSI, this is life-saving care, it's not optional for them, and they're going into debt, crushing debt in order to live their best life and not be miserable and just enjoy themselves and live in the world that we've created. And we have to recognize that we are basically, the same way that we talk about student loan debt in this country, we are putting an even larger financial burden on a particular class of people particular class of marginalized people who are already less likely to have access to economic opportunities, are less likely to have access to education, less likely to have a higher paying job or have employment period, are more likely to be homeless and make up a sizable percentage of our homeless population in Canada. As much as the estimates are between 40 and 70% of youth that are homeless in this country are members of the queer community, specifically trans people. Like, we are already living in legislated poverty, and we're just making something that's life-saving care increase that burden of legislative poverty.
And I think talking about that and talking specifically about the rates of homelessness, we need to consider that like disproportionate among those 2S LGBTQ plus youth, and specifically those two-spirit and trans and non-binary and gender diverse people are racialized people and Indigenous people. So we're really talking about an overrepresentation of queer and trans folks of color within those statistics. And so this brings me a lot to my research and to my work around, well, what is it, like, what are some of the barriers that we're thinking about? And this is where we really need to get out of the box of only focusing on gender affirming care. And it's a problem that we have in this province and in this country. And generally, when we're talking about trans issues and 2S LGBTQ plus issues, is that we think that like, okay, well, there's 2S LGBTQ plus issues, there are racialized communities issues, there are Indigenous issues, as if those identities could not intersect. And that is false. And when we don't acknowledge the intersection of all of those things and how they're going to affect each other, like there is a significant problem. So in this province, where African Nova Scotian communities have historically been pushed out into rural communities, how is that urban-rural divide going to disproportionately affect Black people in this province? And when they are in Halifax, what is the impact of anti-Black racism that is faced and well documented in our health and social service systems? How is that going to affect people trying to access gender-affirming care? I can tell you right now that my wait list is full, like right now, is full of like Black, queer, and trans folks who are like, I want care from a Black, queer, and trans person, because literally I've had so many bad experiences elsewhere that I just won't access service anywhere. I'll wait months and months and months to potentially have an opening with you just because I know that I can't access care with you. And I really think we need to be considering that. Like, who is our system designed for? Who is our system going to disproportionately affect in our capitalist system that's going to inevitably lead to these marginalized communities being lower income, and so leading as well to that marginalization. And another aspect of linguistic care that's really important to me is the linguistic elements. And so as a Francophone, it's very important to me to think about what it means to want to access healthcare in your language and how essential that is. Think about how you feel when you are in pain. And now imagine you were located in rural Quebec and you needed to explain something to someone and nobody spoke English around you, and how alienating that would feel. And just like how, maybe you do speak a little French, but not enough to be able to explain what's happening in your body. And now imagine that reversed for Francophones in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, all across this country outside of Quebec, who are attempting to access services. And when we talk about gender affirming care, we're talking about the basics here, especially in terms of linguistic things. I'm thinking a lot about pronouns. And so French does not have an agreed upon gender inclusive pronoun like they. And also, literally everything has a gender, including this nice feminine table, which is a problem, right? Well, it's a problem. It's tricky insofar as, English and French gender the similar things, we just gender them differently. This is their water bottle in English. But in French, the gender of la bouteille d'eau does not change. It is invariable because the gender belongs to the object, it's not to the person. So we just gender things differently, but we don't think about it that way. And so, first of all, we end up contributing to these ideas that like French and other languages that operate in this way are necessarily like regressive, and like they are not like available to like for people to access gender affirming care in. Of course a problem, of course false, but it reinforces this like idea that we have of like French as like the second of Canada's languages, and of course not even going into the complete erasure of Indigenous languages all over these territories. And so I think about this, and I think about what it means also for people like me who have attempted to access care, or people who want to access care in French. do not have their pronouns, like something as basic as pronouns and gender identity being respected by the healthcare system, and just saying, well, you know what, I know I can, if I go to the English system, I'll get that recognized. I can deal with a little bit of discomfort. My English is great, as you can tell. And so I can easily go turn to the English system, but then what happens to this fundamental core part of who I am? Where does it go? And like that loss of identity is very important. And so a lot of my research touches on this idea of like, how do we form our identities, and language plays an integral part in that. And so we're talking about access to care in French in Nova Scotia. We're talking about that as well, and that also needs to be considered a gender affirming care issue.
Absolutely.
And also, how can we ensure that care in Indigenous languages is adapted as well to that, and ensure that like increased access, because increased access to care in Mi'kma'ki is non-negotiable.
Yeah.
It is absolutely mandatory, and we have such like an even longer way to go on that.
Yeah.
So anyway, so thinking about these things is like, I think we have a tendency to end this here. I think we have a tendency to talk a lot about like these identities as, oh well, this is this like privileged identity, and like cis people are privileged and trans people are oppressed, and you know black people are oppressed and white people are privileged. And I feel like this dynamic is not really helpful in that it doesn't allow us to have the complex, nuanced conversations of like, what do the intersections of all of these things mean, and how do we end up navigating those systems? How do those systems end up moving us through, how do we experience the world through the lens of all of the things that each of us in this room, online, wherever, bring to the world? And that's oftentimes not taken into account, and we need to start focusing on like gender affirming care is a racial justice issue. Gender affirming care is a linguistic justice issue. Gender affirming care is fighting against the violences of capitalism. You know, it's against like all of these things, and we need to have this view of it, because if not, we're going to continue to fail the most marginalized members of our communities. Anyway.
Right. Thank you so much.
I'm going to add this like the tiniest like grounding comment, in that if you were someone who is seeking care like in this exact moment on a practical level, and you have not engaged with the healthcare system in the past years over COVID, televisits are now approved in Nova Scotia, so that is something that we're able to provide at hshc. You will still have to come in for a physical appointment, but only one time. So if you are living rurally, that's a helpful thing. Just like in this moment, what can we do exactly right now? Televisits. So it's like one tiny positive of like practical, you know, happenings on top of like the levels of brilliant thought.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of your reflections, and you know, I think when we think about gender affirming care, it's like it's supposed to be affirming care. And so what I hear from you talking about is like, how do we affirm a person as a whole person and the complexities of who they are, right? So I think this is great. It actually goes really well into the next question, which is when we think about the structures that kind of create the boundaries of the care that exists. So I'm thinking specifically about, so the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, they published the standards of care that serve as the guiding document on how, you know, trans healthcare, gender affirming care is delivered across the globe. So both here in Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia, and around the world. Abby, earlier you were talking about MSI funding criteria, the specialist letter. So we also have these documents as well that really create the kind of care that is delivered. So I'm wondering, you know, how do these structures limit the kind of care that currently exists? And also, how can we imagine gender affirming care beyond these structures?
Yeah, I can take some airtime to throw down MSI a little bit. So HSHC is classified as a boutique clinic by the province. This happened when there was a Me Equals Care Act for family providers. I believe that was 2017. And when that happened without consultation, we got listed as this boutique clinic, i.e. we are not able to build these codes that are meant to give an incentive to create family practices. So that means that for every service that we provide, gender affirming care, but also like your things like PAPs and STI tests, we're paid 23% less than providers out in the community who are part of a family practice. So that's a big bummer, big bummer. So 23% different in income. And then it's a double hit on our providers because we have a high overhead because we're a nonprofit clinic to run our other services. So not only are providers agreeing to a higher overhead fee in the understanding that they're working for a nonprofit clinic, But then they're also being paid 23% less than if they just worked their Tuesday afternoon at their family practice. So that is increasingly frustrating, and we've been having some meetings with the Department of Health and Wellness to try and get that changed, but clearly that Me Equals Care came into place a bunch of years ago and it still hasn't happened, so very, very frustrating for us. There are no specific gender affirming care codes other than like a regular office visit or like a 30-minute counseling or a full physical exam fee that you would bill for one of those gender affirming care visits. So there's not a lot of incentive because you would be getting paid the exact same amount if you did a quick in and out STI test versus a gender affirming care visit, which are obviously a much larger sort of scope of practice for medicine. So that's another issue that needs to be dealt with as far as our billing system goes. And then all of the application management for surgeries, as well as the healthcare navigation piece, is all uncompensated. So us managing your referrals, if they get rejected because MSI is so nitpicky for approvals, or letter gets lost, or they took 8 weeks to get back to you, so we called them for you to figure out what's going on, all of that is an uncompensated piece. As well as the healthcare navigation that we are doing because of the gaps in the NSHA system. So many folks of all communities, but especially trans communities, even if they don't have any intention of seeing us at hshc, will touch base with us at some point just to figure out how to do it, which we are happy to provide, but we are doing that as a totally uncompensated model. So it makes the pressures on us as this tiny little nonprofit clinic that's not really supposed to fill out these gaps even harder to maintain. So MSI billings are nemesis. And lots of folks also think that we are an NHSA service that makes decisions for the province. We also saw this with STI testing when it was paused during periods of COVID. Lots of nasty messages on our Instagram about like, how dare you shut down STI testing? What's wrong with you? As if I have control over laboratory testing. So folks see us as this like pivotal spot in the healthcare system, and we are not really that. So folks think that we have a lot of influence over what is required for an MSI application, or that we are purposely putting up these barriers to getting you your surgery, and that is simply not true. So lots of frustrating pieces there in that, like, I want that specialist letter requirement gone. That would save us all so much time and energy and headache and healthcare resources. But I, other than like meetings and press releases, don't have any pull in that regard. So, yeah.
Sorry, if I can add a quick comment.
I just want to jump in. Sorry. I have a moderator question. We just had a note for everyone to slow down a little bit for the interpreters. It's okay. I also can talk very fast, and I'm sure they're working really hard. We can't see them, but we just need to slow it down.
Yeah, I can do that.
Great. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you again, interpreters, for all of your work.
Thank
you. Again, I'm seeing this from the perspective of a clinician who is having folks reach out about access to letters and all of these things. And to be clear, with the structure that we have now, Lambda Health is basically engaging in like fee for service. And so people come to us, we have sessions, we do counseling sessions, but they pay us, right? Of course, we need to have publicly funded mental health care in this province, period. But a portion of this is also that an issue is also in the barriers that are created by the WPATH standards of care, which require these letters in the first place. The idea that I, as a person who just met you, have more competency to decide and to determine what your gender is than you do is absolutely off the chain. Like it's unhinged to me that this is the way that our system works, and it is a complete failure in terms of the way that these systems work. I do it, and I talk to people, and I'm like, "What's your gender?" And they're like, "Okay, cool, this is it." And I'm like, "Okay, great, like that's your gender," and it's done because it's none of my business at the end of the day. But the way that these systems are structured, I still have to do due diligence, and I have to go through these things. And if someone's going to be paying me like a full rate for these services, I'd rather that they come out with an assessment that they can keep and hopefully will serve them in some other way. But it's shameful that I have to do it in the way that I do. And this is a problem that is, yes, funded in the WPATH standards of care, which will be changing very soon, but not significantly enough to make that irrelevant, so it doesn't really matter. But also of MSI for creating these systems in which letters can get lost, And fundamentally, it's because trans and non-binary people are not a priority for this government and for the health authority. Our needs are seen as something that can be pushed aside, or that which are specialty needs, which need to be dealt with at boutique clinics instead of critical parts of our healthcare system that need to be addressed. And so, as a clinician, I can say that it's shameful that I have to spend so much of my time doing this, especially when trans and non-binary folks and two-spirit folks have so many more pressing issues that they could be using their time to see like a social worker and mental health professional to deal with, right? I'd love to be helping more trans and non-binary folks, like spend less time helping them navigate systems which were fundamentally not designed for them, and more time challenging the structural barriers that have created such internalized transphobia within our communities, and helping folks deal with the externalized transphobia that they're confronted with in this increasingly hostile society. That's my priority. And like, it just seems like, yeah. And so I think one of the issues, and this is a really important thing, is that we have this understanding of how systems work. And this idea that we can like modify these systems from the inside, and we can do all of these things, and I don't believe that that is possible. And it sounds sad to say, but I just don't know that it's possible to modify systems in this way. I'm thinking about, and you'll probably speak on this, but going to meetings with people who run gender affirming care, like who decide on gender affirming care policy, who literally have no idea about anything, like the first like ideas of what gender affirming care is about. And so why are we fighting with these structures? Like how can we engage with these systems in a way that is alternative? And I think there's a unfortunate lack of radical imagination when it comes down to this, and ideas of how we can start critically engaging outside of these systems and being like, these systems have never worked for us, so why are we fighting for inclusion in them? What does it mean for us? I'm like being that social work philosophy person, being like, sprinkle this in, but what does it mean for us to fight for inclusion in systems that were fundamentally never designed with us in mind? I don't know. Yeah. There's a lot of like subtext there and things to reflect on, but yeah.
There's always subtext. Yeah. All of these systems are subtext. I always like to start with the fact that since I received my MSI assessment, I went through Dalhousie, was very lucky, I got through very fast. MSI has lost my letter 4 times. Raised recently as this week. So this is something that is happening, and it happens to basically every single person who tries to access gender affirming care in this province. I have not heard a single story where someone submit the letter once and there was no issues. It either gets lost, it either gets denied, it gets turned back for whatever reason. No one has ever, that I have met, and I've talked to more than 200 trans people in this province alone, let alone outside this province. It has never once happened to my knowledge.
That would be so nice on our admin team.
Nice. As soon as you mentioned that, I was like, I can appreciate that, because Dal is going through this for me right now, where they have sent my letter 4 times and MSI keeps losing it. We're never getting it. But we also need to talk about, and I think a lot of this comes down to, even beyond the issue of medicalization, it comes down to our binary systems thinking. We see the world as typically male, female. And even in that, in the trans community, if people who view the world as that binary see past it, still see it as male to female, female to male. When the majority of trans people identify as somewhere on the gender diverse or non-binary spectrum. You even hear that with a lot of people who are detransitioners. The majority of people who do transition, I believe the statistics that are coming out of the project that's currently being conducted, is 60% of people who detransition retransition?
We don't have statistics.
No statistics?
We don't have statistics in our study.
Okay, that's good to know. But a lot of people are detransitioning, retransitioning because they've been forced into this binary care that they don't actually need. And a lot of that comes down to being, when you go into these assessments, and you'll hear people who have been through these assessments talk about the trans test, where you walk into a room and you have to prove to typically a cisgender, straight, white person that you are trans. And typically that means binary trans. Our system is only now starting to have very limited wiggle room for non-binary trans people, and that has created systems of so many people I know who have to go into these spaces and they identify closer to how we identify, but they have to play the role of a trans woman that they are not in order to be able to access the surgeries, because if they don't, they'll be seen as not trans enough and be denied services. And part of this comes down to the checking of the boxes. That's just the reality that our systems, both because of issues with organizations like WPATH and recommendations from WPATH, and the systems that we exist ourselves in Nova Scotia Health. Not only are we having to prove we're trans and even having more often than not to lie about our care needs, it goes a step further. You can't access specific kinds of gender affirming care in this province, or really anywhere in Canada, unless you go on hormones, regardless of whether you need them, those hormones, whether you can even take them if you have an here comes my stutter, endocrinological. I have a very bad stutter, I apologize. If you have an issue with your endocrine system, that you can't take hormones, whether that's ET, progesterone, or even puberty blockers, you'll be denied the rest of your care. Or you're someone like me who does not require to go on hormones, you'll be denied the rest of your care. And it's ridiculous that we have basically told people, oh, you can only access the care you need if you access care you don't need. And that's not actually reflective of addressing people's dysphoria, trying to create euphoria, and actually providing the health care that people actually need. Imagine going in to get your gallbladder removed and saying, oh, well, in order to remove your gallbladder, we also have to remove your spleen. You'd be ridiculous. That's ridiculous. But that's the same thing we're doing with gender affirming care.
I'm wondering if you have any reflections, because I know that a lot of your research is about this topic.
Oh, I'm putting me in the hot spot. No, I think these are all really important questions, and I like that, how do we imagine care beyond these structures? Because what I'm hearing from all of you talking about today is, not only how are our systems failing, I'm going to use the word failing, right? I feel like if our provincial funding body is losing letters consistently, it's failing. So how are our systems failing, but also how do these systems create narratives that we then have to exist within, right? How do they create like trans-normative discourses of like what it means to be a trans person within a colonial structure, within a gender binary system, within, cis-normative ideals of what it means to be a trans person or a person, right? And so so in my thesis research, I looked at this idea of epistemic justice within gender affirming care. So what are the ways in which like people are seen as knowers of their own experience, and how does that manifest through the assessment process? And it really leaves me wondering, and I don't really have the answers to this, but that's why I like the conversation, is like, do we have a system that's set up to meet the needs of service providers? It sounds like it's also not even really doing that. But is it also meeting the needs of trans people, right? And how is it affirming who people are? Because I think when I think about this, it's gender affirming care. How do we provide care that cares for people and affirms who they are? And I have hesitations around whether that exists through the creation of eligibility requirements.
Yeah, I think it goes even a step further in that trans existence, like we always talk about, we have always been here. We've always been here in cultures, whether they are Indigenous cultures, whether they're even European cultures, we have always existed. The difference was, before the current state of regulation of records in Western countries, we were stealth. People didn't know we existed. People would just move to a different town and be themselves, and no one would ever know about it. And we have to reflect on the reality that our current system of hyper-recording data and information that frequently we don't need to be recording, to be frank. Whether that's having male, female, or even X if you're intersex on your birth certificate. There's certain information that we really don't need as a government or society to even be recording in the first place.
Like, wouldn't it make more sense for your health card to have your blood type on it than your gender?
Right. Yes.
And then people are like, well, it's about genitals or whatever and all of this stuff. And it's like, okay, well, if you can change your gender marker without having any like change to your genitals, then your argument means nothing.
Also, the only person who needs to know about me and my genitals are me, my partner, and my doctor.
There we go. Right.
Like that end of sentence.
Yeah, I will lightly push back on the idea of like we were always here. I dislike the narrative of we were always here because I think it's rooted in like a colonialist narrative that's like rooted in this idea of like,
That's valid.
what's the word I'm looking for? I guess it would be like trans normativity.
Yeah,
this
that's
idea
fine.
that like trans identity is rooted in trans identity and how we understand trans people is a Western concept. And as we said earlier, right? Like the idea of being trans is like rooted in this idea of colonialism and the gender binary and all of these things which did not exist prior to European colonization of these lands, and where it was not like enforced on people in the same way before European colonization. And so I think when we think about this idea of like we have always been here, we need to be very careful of not being like trans people have not always been here, right? Gender diversity has always been here, 100%. We've always, I mean, it's a fundamental like part of the human experience is gender diversity. I would actually even say like gender diverse people are like the idea of gender binary being enforced on people is the problem, right? But I think we need to be very careful to like avoid falling into a narrative of like being like, oh, LGBT people around the world. It's like, okay, but people don't use the terms LGBT, they might use other terms, and when we come in and we say like you have to use these terms, we're like engaging in another form of colonialism that like enforces these identities onto people without actually thinking about it.
I'm just used to the soundbite piece that everyone likes. Part of it too is that we have, in cross cultures globally too, like you said, they don't use the same words. The concept of the gender binary or what it even means to be queer has literally shifted between, you know, you can go from decade to decade in cultures across the world, and it has literally meant something different to someone different in everywhere in the world for all of time. And while we only call it trans experience now, of course, absolutely. I don't want to. I know exactly. I'm used to this soundbite. I apologize.
But I think this is part of the conversation,
absolutely.
Right? Like we're having this conversation and we're highlighting these things that are often invisible, right?
Exactly.
And when we think about, you know, when I think about texts and documents, we think about DSM diagnostic codes, we think about the WPAS standards of care, we think about MSI funding criteria. You know, these things are written in a way where there's like these taken for granted assumptions underneath them. And also I think when we think about the emergence of like trans people as a category, you know, going back to, so in my thesis, like going back to reading Harry Benjamin's text, who created the Harry Benjamin Institute for Gender Dysphoria, which became the WPAS standards of care, you know, and he's writing this typography of like, what is the true transsexual? And so in this way, like what it means to be a trans person came about within Western discourse through processes of medicalization. So when we're talking about like medicalization, it's like the very fundamental understanding of what it means to be trans is inseparable from processes of Western medicalization, but we don't think about it in that way. And so that's why it's really interesting to think about like what could being trans, or maybe to use your, you know, gender diverse mean outside of medicalization. Right? We don't even necessarily have that.
We're not there yet.
No.
We gotta fix the broken systems.
Yes, but also we're in this system.
But also,
so what
also, we have to be very careful about time because we're like, we have to be very careful.
Okay.
About an hour.
So we've got two more questions for our panelists, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So this goes back to the context. We're thinking about the context, and you know, we live in a current climate of anti-trans backlash. We can think about this both through legislation that's being passed in the United States right now. We can also think about it through regressive policies that are being enacted also outside of legislation. You know, I've heard from folks who work in this field, like also in Ontario, that medical providers who used to prescribe hormones through, you know, an informed consent model where they wouldn't require a psychosocial assessment before prescribing. It's now becoming more common practice to require those assessments. So we're seeing a backsliding, and we're living in a climate of anti-trans hostility. And so my question for the panelists is, what can we do to resist this?
I think I'll take this one because I'm a dual Canadian American citizen. I spent over a decade of my life living in the state of Florida. So when I see these things happening, specifically in places that I lived and to people that I know exactly what that fear is directly related to these laws. You also look at what's happening in the United Kingdom, where they specifically passed a ban on conversion therapy and modified it at the last second to take out trans and gender diverse individuals from that ban. We should be scared because this is the reality we're dealing with. We're dealing with extreme backlash, and from things, you even look in the United States, there's conversations for after most likely Roe v. Wade is repealed. There's conversations that Governor Abbott, the governor of Texas, is going to introduce a challenge to queer marriage. We should be scared, because there's no reason why these things can't happen here. With that, there are specific protections in Canadian law, specifically the Canada Human Rights Act, and specifically in historical challenges in Canadian case law, that do provide us some level of protection. But we also have to remember that the Bill C-16, the one that expanded the Canada Human Rights Act to include gender identity and expression, doesn't have many test cases. So it has not strong legal footing here in Canada. So while we do have levels of security legally that does not exist in other contexts, they're not as strong as a lot of people, like, and realistically, cis people like to think they are. They like to think that we have, we are here in Canada, we're Canadian exceptionalism, we don't discriminate, we don't do this and that. We absolutely do these things. Just because it seems like it's worse in the United States is not necessarily true. It's typically just as bad here as in the United States. And what protections we do have very weak legal footing. And part of that, and this is, I know, the conversation that we might have in a little bit, part of that is we need people to come forward and initiate charter challenges and other issues, and have issues, and I know we can talk about using the systems against them, but part of ensuring in our current context that we have these protections are not only there, but actually work, is by continuously putting case tests against these laws. Because without those cases, in a case law system that's based on legal precedent, if we don't have case tests from which to base future case decisions on, the law sits there. So what we need to do as a society, as a group, is be in it's a very tough act, and I say this as someone who's going through a human rights case myself right now. We have to be brave. We have to find support and solidarity with our own communities so that the people who have these experiences that could go up and serve as the basis of charter challenges and legal rights challenges feel comfortable, safe, and supported to go forward with them. Because that's the only way that we ensure that these legal protections here in Canada stick. Because our entire system of our entire system of law and policy is based in case law, and it's based on legal precedent. So unless we have the bravery, and I know it's a huge ask, because it's a huge ask that I'm going through right now, we have to have the bravery and the individuals who have experienced it to step forward, and we have a responsibility as a community to stand behind them and support them as they go through it. Sorry, I apologize. I know I speak fast. That's just the reality of this current system, and I know we like to talk about. Oh,
we're going to get into it.
We're going to get into it. Talking about whether or not we should be using their own system and inclusion in these systems that were designed to exclude and oppress us, and whether we actually want integration into these systems. If we want, like well, I mean, inclusion.
I mean, I can go into this.
I'll let you take it. You know better than I do. You know better than I do.
Oh my God. So this system is really tricky, right? And again, I come up with this, like, I have like a perspective on this that I think is a bit atypical, but is really good in terms of folks who are maybe looking for readings on this subject or anything like that. A really good book is edited by Ryan Conrad called Against Equality, Queer Revolution, Not Mere Inclusion, if I'm not mistaken. Might be wrong on the tagline, but it's Against Equality for sure. And it really forces us to reflect on these issues, right? What good is hate crimes legislation when we're living through a housing crisis that's probably disproportionate, that is very likely, and we don't have the data for it, which is violent in and of itself, disproportionately affecting trans and non-binary folks, right? People who are more likely to face housing discrimination. What good is the hate crime legislation doing for you there? Right? And it's like, and I think the issue that I have with this is that we spend so much time and so much energy and specifically so much money in supporting these like movements and ignoring the fact that like we can have a radical imagination and create a better world. And when we spend a lot of like art, and I'm not to say that people should not be creating charter challenges and doing all of these things, 100% agree, right?
Both are correct.
Exactly, both are correct. But, and both are necessary. But what I guess I'm pointing out is that we need to be critically reflecting on what it means to be engaging with these systems in the first place, which again have never been designed for in our interest, and show that every single time. I mean, look, like, I'm a black person in this country. Police don't work for me. So when we talk about hate crime legislation, who do I have to go to? And so when we're talking about black trans people facing violence, like, where are we going? We're not going to the cops. And if we don't go to the cops, our complaint isn't recognized. And so who does hate crime legislation serve? It serves white people. It serves people who are comfortable enough to go to the police. And like, as long as we continue to engage with that system and to justify it, we legitimize it. And I refuse to legitimize a system that is fundamentally based on the fact that I should not be here. This, like, and we can go back to this, but like I can go back this far, but like this system, like black people are not supposed to be here. Like, black people and trans people and gender diverse folks and queer folks, none of us are supposed to be here. We are supposed to be dead. Like, when black people were brought to this land, they were brought here for labor and then to be expendable. And we can tell that this is the case because of the ongoing treatment of black people in this country. And so, as we continue to engage with these systems, as we continue to engage with the overrepresentation of black folks in interpellation policière, in police checks, street checks, thank you. As we see this, we need to also make the links between what does it mean for, how do these systems relate to in terms of control? Because fundamentally, all these MSI systems and all of these ideas of getting these forms and whatever are rooted in control. You are trying to take things that you don't deserve from our system, and we need to prove that you have the right to this. But who gets to determine that right? Who gets to determine my gender? Who gets to determine any of these things? And that's rooted in a fundamental idea that, like, of all of our governments, of all political stripes, that they have the right to determine who does and does not qualify for care, whose life does or does not have value. With black folks, they just exercise it a bit more immediately, right? Usually at a police stop, usually with a gun, right? And so when it comes down to it at the end of the day, we're talking about the same kinds of systems. And so if we can recognize that those systems are not serving black folks, if we recognize that they're not serving Indigenous folks, that the RCMP was literally created as a colonizing force in this country and continues to serve that interest, and we can see the ongoing violence of those systems and how they don't really care about us, even through the current mass casualties report and what's been happening right here in Nova Scotia, like, we need to be able to make that link between that and these other systems, which are also benefiting from our continued engagement with them. And we deserve more than that. As like trans and non-binary folks, I think we deserve more than that. I just want to like end that like very sad moment with something, this like hopeless moment with something by Hunter Ashley Shackelford, who wrote this article titled "You Could Never Misgender Me." Just give you a little bit of it. While my truth looks like shifting power by redefining the intimacy of gender, not everyone feels affirmed by this. Some trans folks use pronouns. It's not everyone. Sorry. For me, my gender is always in fugitivity. You cannot capture what you cannot see. You cannot put chains on what shapeshifts. You have zero power and zero ability to misgender me through the use of the wrong pronoun because my gender is not accessible to you. In my essay, Giving Birth to Language, I write, there are as many genders as there are people. Gender is not the absence or the presence of, but rather an affirmation within yourself. Your gender is ever evolving, mutating, transitioning, at war, at peace, but always at home because it lives within you. Acknowledging the vastness of gender is the act of breaking chains from the violence of boxes, cages, limitations, and rigid definitions. Your gender will never fit into one word because your being will always be the lexicon. Wow. And I think when we think about how we're going to engage with these systems, that is the approach that I want to come at that is authentic to all of our experiences with gender, irrespective of whether we fall under the under any type of trans umbrella, or even if we're cis, because all of our genders are so personal and intimate, and they could never fit into the systems that are created, let alone a binaristic system that either creates a binary of male-female or a binary of binary and non-binary, right?
Even
they're all
cis trans binaries.
All of these, right?
Yeah.
And none of them actually hold space for any of that. And we have a responsibility, I would argue, to like actively fight against that. And I think that like a lot of our efforts could be better spent doing that than they could ever be engaging with a system which was never created for us in the first place. Anyway.
Great, wow.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, I mean, like, from our, like, I'm coming from like a clinic, right? Like a center, it's our job to listen to you and like think about those thoughts. As like a service provider, as far to like actually answer the question, we haven't really seen too much. You'd be surprised how little hate we get actually, which is like very nice. Hooray. But the most hate that we do get actually comes from TERFs. Rather than like a more traditional, like religious or like conservative sort of angle, which is kind of just an interesting thing that we can like reflect on. But I'm like happy to report from like a clinical perspective as service providers. But again, none of our service providers are trans, so that's kind of the different space there.
I always say too, in my experience, like going through prides, including prides in the southern United States, you know, there's always religious people handing out pamphlets, but they never harass. They just kind of stand there and hope that they'll get someone's interest.
Yeah.
TERFs actively target. They
Yeah.
seek you out, they will find you, and they will do everything they can to make you feel miserable about your existence or for supporting people like us up here. Like, that's just the reality. Religious people, you know, some TERFism is founded in religion, but, you know, when I go to Pride, I have no problem walking past the religious table. I see the TERF tables or the TERF anti-protesters, and I keep a mile radius because they are dangerous and they will seek to hurt you.
Great, thank you. You know, a question on that, it's not in the list of questions, so a curveball, but it made me think about this because I think that, you know, one thing that a lot of TERFs bring up is this idea of, you know, what about people who detransition? And so I wanted to put it to the panelists, you know, when we're thinking about gender affirming care, I think we need to welcome in people who are transitioning and also people who are detransitioning or retransitioning or following non-linear gender transitions. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts around how our current systems of care do that or not, or how they could do that better.
They barely consider trans people, let alone detransitioners. I know, sorry.
Well, I mean, I think the thing is that the systems are meant, like, as I think as you mentioned, the systems force people to lie. They force you into this binaristic narrative of what it means to be trans and what it does not mean to be trans, and in so doing, force people into this like lens of lying. And Gabriel and I have actually had a lot of conversations around this. And have we ever considered that the fact of forcing people into this very rigid definition of like what trans is, considering that there are as many genders as there are people, that try to fit people into these two extraordinarily binaristic categories, often for the like ease of cis straight people and for their diagnostic medicalization criteria, actually fosters detransition, because there is no space for gender exploration. There is no space to like to have like a different understanding of how you might want to interact with your body, especially as like a non-binary person. What do I want gender affirming care to look like for me? And like that question alone is like removed by the fact is rendered irrelevant by the fact that I need to lie to get access to care. And when as long as any person is needing to like hide a portion of who they are in order to do this, they're going to potentially have like infinitely more avenues for detransition or retransition to occur, right? And also, retransition as a term, I get it, like it's fine, but like transition never was like a beginning to end process. It's never over. It's kind of like we were saying, like coming, like when we would say that like I came out versus like, okay, well like I'm always coming out because I'm coming out in every aspect of my life at all times, right?
Not a secular.
And so and in the same ways, transition is the same, right? Like we are always exploring and understanding our relationships with our bodies in different ways. And that does not move our status from like good tran to like done, follow the steps to like complete transition complete checkbox to then retransitioner, just because we are continuing this process of exploration. And so I think there's like a question around language there, but there are people who use that terminology, and so we respect that. And there are people who detransition and go back to like have trans experience and then go back and identify as cis, and those people still have trans experiences, and we need to respect them and like hold space for their experiences because they are trans experiences and they're just as valid even though they didn't end up in like like that person went back to identifying as cis. That kind of gender re-identifying with their birth sex. And so that's something that we need to hold a lot more space for in trans communities, and we're particularly bad at it.
Oh yeah, I absolutely, whenever I have conversations about detransition and detransitioners, I always say they either are, still are, or were once a member of our community, and they deserve that respect on that basis alone. I always talk about too, I'm in the process of doing a revision of GACNS that includes coverage for detransition care. Because that is gender affirming care as well. And we need to respect that reality, especially when we are, like you just said, in our current system. More often than not, people are part of detransition. You're forced to access care that you don't need. And then you are then basically forced to do something to your body that you didn't want to do, but the system has determined is medically necessary for you in order to get the care that you actually need. And part of that is a big piece, and we haven't talked much about the policy, so I'm going to touch on it and then walk away because this is not about the policy itself.
Just go for it, Riley.
But part of this is centering the individual who is accessing care in their own care. Why is anyone but the person who is accessing gender affirming care making decisions about what happens to their body? Why is a doctor determining, oh, you're not trans, and this is something I've experienced. When I started getting my first assessment before I went to DAL, I was told I was probably not trans enough because I don't want to go on hormones. And my response is, well, what does hormones have to do with my need for top surgery? The apples, oranges, they're not related. And to think that I might have fallen into the detransitioner category if I was then forced to go into getting hormones in order to access the surgery that I actually need to save my life. We need to reflect on the reality that, like you said, Vincent, a lot of the detransition reality as we're coming to understand it, and we really don't understand it. The research does not exist. As much as the world is unfriendly to trans people, the world is more unfriendly to detransitioners, mainly because they have a whole other group of people hating them, which is many members of the trans community.
We'll say though, we have a paper coming out in
Yes,
a couple weeks.
I was going to ask more. There's a wonderful Twitter page that if you guys are interested in learning more about transition, it's research that you're doing and that Ross is doing, and Kinnan Ross, and
we'll link it.
Yeah, well, I'll tweet it out later. You'll probably see it. We retweet it a lot, but a lot of the stigma around detransition has to come from the check boxes that we've put on transition. It also comes from a deeper issue that exists within the trans community of collecting surgeries or needing, the more trans you are, the more care that you need, and people feeling that they, in order to be seen as legitimately trans by members of their own community, they have to access as much gender affirming care as possible. And that's not what makes trans identity. That's not what makes trans experience. What makes you trans isn't how many procedures you've accessed, or how much vocal training you've had, or how many hormones you take, or how long you've been on puberty blockers as a kid. What makes you trans is that you do not align with your gender that society has deemed that you align with. That is, for me, the base conceptualization of what it means to be trans. And again, it comes down to even the cis-trans divide is a binary that is still not talked about as well. And a lot of these issues are I say, as we live in a society, of our own creation. And if we just tried a little harder to center people in their care instead of checking boxes, a lot of these issues wouldn't be issues.
Thanks, Riley. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so we have about 850 odd patients for gender affirming care currently registered, and then another 50 on the wait list. So we see a pretty big hunk. I had a casual ask when I saw your paper about the detransition of our physicians, asking how many folks we've actually ever seen who have done that, and I got 2 or 3 patients. So, but that's a really hard thing to actually monitor, because you never know if folks just stop coming to the center, because there's no diagnostic code for detransition.
Right.
So I can search up a patient list to see every single person we've ever used gender dysphoria code for, but I can't look at detransition conversation. There's just no way for me to access that information, so the systems certainly aren't built for it. I do think about how getting service provision for primary level gender affirming care is so low and poor when it comes to a very binaristic sort of situation. We see a lot of non-binary folks here, but it definitely makes me think that there would be a larger funnel into HSHC because they know that our providers are equipped to have at least a slightly more complex conversation on gender than what their primary care physician might be interested in having.
I always say in consultation with members of the trans community in Nova Scotia, practically every single person I spoke to touched a sexual health center at least once in their transition process. So this is not like, that always goes back to the conversation about boutique and specialized care. Like I touched Halifax Sexual Health Centre in my gender affirming care processes. Practically every single person we've consulted with has touched y'all at some point.
22% of trans and non-binary people access care at the Halifax Sexual Clinic, as per
the census.
Staff Canada. So I am part of a national research study in exploring the experiences of people who detransition, retransition, or follow non-linear gender transition. So we'll link to the Twitter in the webinar. We have some papers, one that just got accepted to JAMA about healthcare experiences. So really excited because we really, as you said, we don't have, the clinics are not set up to collect the data. There's not a lot of research done in Canada. So
it also feels like the systems and like all of the barriers that are put in place are meant to like prevent detransition. And that's like a question that we get, or at least I do when I do different like professional development sessions with different healthcare providers, which are by request, certainly not like a systems-based thing that people are going through. And that is a question that I get pretty often, like, well, what if they regret it? And it's just like, okay.
Right, and
right? Like it is something that is asked. People are thinking about it, but I think it's like you're 9 steps ahead. Like you haven't even gotten to the part of like figuring out how to provide the gender affirming care at all, or like conceptualizing gender, period, versus you're already like trying to think about like, what if they regret it? And just like spooking themselves, really.
But that dynamic, that dynamic is rooted in like, in a fundamental idea that's like homophobic, right? And it's like rooted in this, also in misogyny at the end of the day, right? I mean, think about how many younger folks with uteruses have been like told like, you can't get a hysterectomy because like, what if? Or like, you can't get your tubes tied because what if you decide later on? What if you regret it? These are the excuses that are used against people's bodies in this way, right? And it's rooted in the fundamental idea of like the control of the body, which is rooted in misogyny, and of course, but
seeing as people with uteruses, baby makers and baby makers.
Exactly, right? Like, and so there's this idea that's behind that is totally true, right? But again, it's this idea of like, well, they don't know what they're talking about. It's the removal of agency, of like you are not seen as a person who can decide what is best for your own experience. If you're interested in that, read Gabriel's thesis. Epistemic justice is the name of this concept, but it's fascinating because it reminds us that like it's infantilization at the end of the day. Like you don't get to decide who you are, what choices you want to make with your body, like what gets to happen for you. I've been in conversations with I was on a research what's the word for them, like a CAB, like a community advisory board for research, talking about plasma donation for Ima Quebec, so the equivalent of the Quebec equivalent of the Canadian Blood Services, and we spent so much time talking about the interests of blood donors to not get like queer like plasma from like LGBTQ plus men who are like gay, bisexual, trans, queer, or other men who have sex with men. We spent so much time talking about that and almost nothing about the idea that they were literally thinking about segmenting blood and being like, you are going to be, like your blood's going to be put in quarantine for extra time because we just don't know in this thing, right? And so, and this is the thing, right? Like it's like blood donors not seen as knowers of their own experience. Yeah, you do that, but you don't actually know about the science. We know better than you about your own experiences, about your likelihood, the risk of contracting HIV, all of these things, right? And it's all rooted in this idea of like who has control. And once you start to conceptualize the idea of like who has control, that fundamentally shapes the way that you understand all of these issues and how they're all connected, because they're rooted in maintaining social control. Anyway.
Yep. Great reflections. So we have one more question for our panelists, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. And so this question really spoke to me. It was one of them that was given ahead of time, and so it was from a parent who was asking, what can I do to support my adolescents so that they don't lose hope? And as we're talking about these systems and we're talking about all the problems, there are people today who are waiting to access care. And so what can we do to support, our children, our partners, our community members as they are navigating these systems?
I always say, and it comes down to really any social justice issue, is first listen and center the voices of the people who are actually impacted in what's happening. And honestly, it comes down to two concepts: stand up and fight back. Honestly, if you see something that is happening that is contrary, whether that's the ban on providing gender affirming care, period, to anyone under the age of 19 in Alabama, if you see something like that happening, or even things that are smaller, don't let it hide, call it out, center it, spotlight it, and make people, when they tell you, I am being harmed or targeted, validate them. Make them feel heard, and don't let their voices get drowned out, essentially, is the simple way that I always view about it. If you focus yourself in solidarity with everyone around you, you will rarely go wrong.
That word, I love it. So I have this controversial thing that I say in most of the workshops that I give, which is basically people ask about allyship, basically. How can I be a better ally? And my response is, I don't believe in allies. I've never met an ally. It's not possible, because I don't think allies exist. I don't think it's possible to be one. And this can be controversial, but it makes sense when you think about it in this way. Ally is an identity. And when it's an identity, it's about you. Who gave you that identity? Who gave you the right to call yourself an ally? Where did you get that? And it's not, it's rooted in being an identity and not in your behavior and your action, which is the problem. We have a word for what what we want when we talk about so we can, basically what I'm getting at is that we can act in allyship, but we are not ever allies per se as an identity, because it's never about us.
It's a verb, not a noun.
It's a verb, not a noun. And I would go even further and just disconnect us from the word ally completely and use the word solidarity. So how can I act in solidarity with people? And in doing that, I think there's a few things that we need to challenge, and we see it in terms of racial justice, we see it in terms of trans and non-binary folks. It's what we're basically talking about is overcoming shame and guilt and knowing whether or not is it my role to stand up? Is it my role to say something? I don't want to unconsciously use ableist language, is it my role to say something in situations in which I see something is wrong and I don't want to do anything? I do a fun activity in workshops that I do in person where I say, raise your hand if you'd like to be treated the way that we treat Black people in Canada in 2022. And nobody raises their hand. And I'm no, you must not have understood. If you want, we live in an equal society, we have protections and everyone's equal before the law. And if you'd like to be treated the way that Black people are treated, then just raise your hand. And nobody ever does. And then my answer is, so that means you see what's happening. You've chosen not to act. Because this behavior benefits you in some way, it does something, whatever. And it's exactly the same thing about trans and gender diverse folks. We see what's going on. You see what's happening. The information is there. You can access it. There is willful ignorance behind that. And any time that there's that kind of willful ignorance, if we're not standing up, what right do we ever have to call ourselves an ally, right? I'm going in this negative perspective because I know y'all are going to kill it with actual creative support things. So I just want to foment this reflection. But yeah, I think we start having critical reflections about who we are and when we want to do something, right? And when we're going to support folks. And another part of that is considering, and this is the social worker perspective again, what happens to us when we live oppression? What's happening in your body, right? I'm not going to go into the physiological explanation of what's going on, but the activation of your your autonomic nervous system is doing all of these things, and it's basically it's activating you physically, and so you feel the pressure, you feel that tension in your chest, you feel that your thoughts rushing, you feel yourself that butterflies in your stomach, you feel all of it, right? Again, why the body-mind dichotomy is bullshit, but at the end of the day, what we're not connecting with is that people are going to need support through that as well. And so when things are going on like that, when we're in the kind of political climate that we're in right now, when we were planning this workshop, or Gabriel was going out and getting ready to do an interview on like trans access to gender affirming care, and got a phone call from a random journalist that we didn't know, and I was like, how do you know that person? Did you Google them? Do you know who they are? Did they find your information on the website? Are they trying to lure you to this public place so that they can like start taking videos and photos of you because they're TERFs and all of these things? That activation is happening in your body, and it's a form of physical stress. And that physical stress is called minority stress, and it leads to massive impacts in your health outcomes. It leads to increased likelihood of diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol, all sorts of like physiological issues that are rooted in this experience of trauma. And so when we're talking about being an allyship, it means also supporting people through that. It's like, how can I listen to you right now? How can I like create space to address this issue that is happening in your body right now? And that's another element that I think we really need to like hold space for. And so like thinking about these like experiences of living in this deeply transphobic world as in and of itself a form of physical violence and responding to it in consequence.
Great,
Anyway.
thank you.
I think one piece that you can do for someone is the like information gathering or the navigation portion. That is something like, no, I can't pull up your child's file and like tell you where they're at or whatever without their consent. But what you can do is like give us a call and touch base on that navigational piece, or look up those portions online, find out exactly what a letter of readiness is. You can do that for somebody else. So that's something that I think is like pretty practical. As well, if you're a healthcare provider or if you know one, there are free courses that you can take that will go towards your continuing education credits. So like force every healthcare provider you know. I have the pamphlets in my bag if anyone has a family doctor that they want to give a pamphlet to. But there are resources there. That's our new thing now when we get referrals in for gender affirming care, is we're self-referral first of all, so we send that back and like they have to call themselves, but we always include this like little tidbit that's like, just so you know, you too can learn how to do this. It will take you 3 hours and you're good to go. So those practical sort of things do exist. I know that's patchwork on like fixing all the broken things that we're talking about on a higher level, but at least it's something.
Yeah, it's tangible and it exists. And
it is
can access it
tangible,
right now.
yes.
If people are looking for, it kind of builds off of everything that y'all said. Like, if you're looking for a place to start, it's education. Educate yourself, and don't rely on the trans or non-binary or intersex person in your life to educate you, because that builds in minority stress. That is the burden. You make it the burden of the person who is experiencing the trauma to educate you about their trauma. There are a plethora of resources online, people online who will teach you everything you need to know and every question you ask. So if you're looking for a place to start, go online and do some research, and don't rely on your trans friend or your trans coworker to do that work for you. Do the work yourself.
Also,
put some effort in.
That's why we're here.
Exactly.
Literally here talking
This is
about
exactly why we plan events like this, to have an entry level for everyone to come into these conversations, whether you are a researcher on gender affirming care, you're a policy expert, you're helping provide it, or you have literally only just heard the words gender affirming care. Like, this is what resources like this exist for.
Yeah.
So use them, and don't use your friend.
Yeah.
It's not their job.
Great, thank you all so much. Okay, so we are now going to take some questions. So for folks who are joining from the webinar, there is a link to a Google Doc to submit your questions there. We already have about 8 questions submitted. I can tell you right now, we're not going to get through all of them, but there are some really good ones there. But before we go to questions from the Google Doc, in case there's anyone else who wants to submit a question, I did want to open it up to our lovely audience who is here in person, who has been listening to us. And so I think we could take 1, maybe 2 questions from the audience if anyone is interested. The only thing is you have to come up here to talk into my
Yeah, so they can hear you.
Yeah.
Or if you can speak more loudly, that'd be great. Also, if you don't feel comfortable with your voice being recorded on a webinar, which is also fair, you can let us know. We can like write down your question and then repeat it so that it's
Or
not...
type it into the link.
Or you
Yeah.
can also submit it on the Google
Yeah.
Doc.
Yeah.
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 Submitted to the Google link already.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So if you have questions, again, so we'll put it in the Google Doc. So we'll go with some of the questions that we have already. I should have picked where I wanted to start. So this was a question that I thought was a good question. So we kind of got two questions that I'm going to combine. So one was from a current social work student talking about some of the challenges that we've talked about already in terms of like professional colleges that make it difficult for professionals, so people who are in health professions right now, so social work, medicine, nursing. How does our education system that trains professionals and the colleges that regulate professionals create and maintain this system, and what could be changed?
Social worker moment.
Yeah, this is first thought. You go.
I hate every college of social work in this country, in addition to almost every school of social work. And I feel like, okay, my opinion is that like if you come out of a social work degree, this profession that was created to, as again, a means of social control, and you don't hate 90% of your classmates and the entirety of your training and didn't learn almost everything from your community, then you're probably not a good social worker. But there really is something in this training that is an issue. I'm thinking a lot about Kyle Wilby's work. He's a professor in pharmacy at Dow, who has done some really interesting stuff around how we integrate 2S LGBTQ+ folks into curriculum. And the way that social work education generally functions now is you have your core classes, which are basically focused on like serving like cisgender, straight, white families. And then you have, with perspectives and, racist stereotypes thrown in here, just, as a treat. Salt baying in some racist, it's like, just sprinkling in some racist bullshit from time to time. And then you have optional courses, which are, you want to take, let's take queering social work, if you want to work with queer people. Or let's take Afrocentric social work. Incidentally, Dalhousie is the only university in the country that offers a course in social work specifically with Black communities, telling in and of itself. Especially when we consider, overrepresentation of Black youth within departments of youth protection across this country. So we have these, like, basically all of these identities are put into these, like, niche optional courses that you get to take. And the main problem with that is that these identities are overrepresented in all of these systems, and you're not learning how to interact with any of them unless it's your specific interest. So you have these classes for queer social work, which are like 3/4 full or like half full of like queer students who are finally happy to hear literally anything about queer and or trans people in a university setting. And then the other half are people who have literally no idea, and are the target audience, right? Like people who are starting from the basics and want to learn about what it means, like to do social work intervention with queer and trans people. Well-intentioned, but kind of not having an idea of what's going on. And it leads to this dynamic where queer students feel like not validated, and then also these people are not like feeling like shamed for these issues, but more importantly, you're not talking about it in any other context. You're not talking about what it means to do, couples therapy and family therapy with queer and trans people. What does it mean to do, individual group social work intervention with groups of queer men, or like you're just not learning any of these things. And so the issue that what Kyle proposes is actually integrating examples and case studies of queer and trans people and racialized folks and everybody facing like various forms of minoritization into the core curriculum in a way that's not rooted in the course content and that doesn't presume automatically that people are like that your default, right? And this is, I think, something that I've put in an article that is waiting to be published as well, which is that social work intervention posits, or like any form of like service provision in this way posits that a person is the norm until specified otherwise. But what is the norm? And who gets to define the norm? And who gets to determine what the like categorization is of like inclusion into that norm? So who gets to decide how social work intervention happens with Black people? And is that reality going to be adapted to the realities of Black LGBTQ+ people? Or is it just going to be focused on like, oh, you're black, so I need to work this way? And that's what our current model does. You're black, therefore I'm going to go like take the class on black people to figure out how to work with black people. But what about if you're black and queer? What about if you're black and living with a disability? What if you are black and autistic? What if you are dealing with all of these intersections? There is no space for any of that. Black and trans, right? Like literally like not taken into account. And there are specificities within those experiences that really need to be heard and are not, because we're not given the tools to like reflect on these things intersectionally, which is the goal of integrating them into the curriculum more broadly. So that's a huge thing in terms of that, and it's a failure of, for the social work person specifically, it's a failure of every college of social work, as well as the Canadian Association for Social Work Education, that this is not mandated part of the curriculum. And it's also a failure on the side of every school of social work in this country, that these kinds of dynamics are still happening. Right? We're just talking about how everyone failed. Welcome to our talk. Everything's terrible.
Part of it too, building off of that, is the idea that by not integrating these topics into core coursework, is that it's a niche issue, that you're just not going to be providing services to these people, and especially in social work, and especially in healthcare, where you really don't have a choice of who you're serving. You can't approach it like that. And sorry, I just want to comment that. And then there's really two issues that I see with the education issue. And the first is funding, and the second is when and where we do these education interventions. We have to reflect on the reality that while we're talking about gender affirming care, there is a severe lack of funding in queer spaces in general. And I know today that there was just released that there's $9 million that's being released to the 2S LGBTQI+ community. But we have to reflect on the fact that organizations across this country, and especially here in Nova Scotia, where there is no core funding offered by the provincial government for queer services and queer organizations, we're fighting over crumbs, and we're competing against each other in a way that is, you could say it kindly and says it hinders our success, or you can say it more cynically and say it's systemically used to oppress us and making sure that we're fighting each other instead of fighting the system. We need comprehensive core funding available to all queer organizations, or at least the majority of queer organizations in this country and in this province, and part of that is the role of the federal government, and part of that's the role of the provincial government. The provincial government isn't providing any of these funds, and they need to be. Sorry, I apologize. The second piece is where we make these education interventions, because it's all well and good to, future nurses and future doctors and other future health practitioners, we're going to ingrain this stuff into course materials. What about all the people who are currently practicing medicine? Are we requiring them to get training in order to be remain certified? No. Are we providing them opportunities for this education? Or are they forced to seek it out on their own and maybe fund it for their own practice? Like, where are we making these interventions? Because as it is all well and good to make changes to future nurses and future social workers and future doctors and surgeons, the majority of those people are already practicing medicine, and that's their reality. And that's where the intervention is the most severely needed. Because it's all well and good, and we're starting to see changes, I know at DAL, in their medical program at least, to try to do a little bit better, at least with issues of race. Other issues they're still catching up on. I do know there's a huge queer contingent of doctors that are soon to be doctors that are coming out of DAL as well.
Yeah, but
huge. But that doesn't mean anything. Exactly. Who is able to go to med school? Who can afford med school? Are they getting scholarships and grants to be able to afford it? Are they then, once they graduate med school, are they invited to be in the rooms where these conversations are happening to actually address systemic issues? Like, it's systemic, as we've tried to prove. It's a failure at every point. It is, and that's part of the issue too. And when I bring it back to the level of gender affirming care, it's not just surgeries. It's the whole system that provides healthcare to trans people. It's not just gender affirming care. It's funding. It's education. It's denial of service and access. It's invalidation of identity. It's platforming TERFs over trans people. It's invalidating or only highlighting the able-bodied white binary trans people that look and talk the way you want them to. We need to make these interventions everywhere, and that's part of the problem. Is in this society we want the quick band-aid fix. on a broken foundation.
That's what I'm saying.
Exactly. And I know that we have this conversation. We have this conversation all the time. And yes.
To give you an idea of where we're starting, so the program that you were referencing is that there's like Afrocentric cohorts now in Dallas School of Medicine that is creating specific cohorts for Black students to be able to like be grouped together and do all this work and have added mentors and things like that. And someone pointed out in this cohort, hey, why is every single example that's put into all of our slides of what certain things look like on skin always on white people?
Yep.
How long has Dallas Medical School existed? That this is still not a thing, and they're still receiving pushback from professors. Like Black students right now at Dal are mobilizing and doing extra work, going online, looking up every skin condition, finding a photo of it on Black skin, which rare enough, let alone trying to find it on a diversity of skin, of different layers of like melanated skin, and then putting that resource together and distributing it amongst themselves. Why are they doing that work? Why aren't they getting paid for that work? What is the labor of that work? How long does Riley and all of the people who are working with them have to sit around and develop a policy on gender affirming care only to present it to a room of people who have no idea what they're talking about because they have like nothing, and that work is violent. Like that, when we're talking about the violence of these systems that aim to burn us out, like that is what we're talking about. And like they don't, and when we say they weren't designed for us, like that's what I mean. Like they were never even thought about, because the health of Black people does not matter. It was never supposed to matter. So why do we need to put it in the medical book? The health of trans people never needed to matter. So much so that the people who run the Ministry of Health don't even have to think about those issues. And like they're the ones administering the care, right? And so, and they have no conception of what the needs of the community are because they haven't even thought to consult. And when someone does come and put something together, they're not recognized, they're not compensated for that work, there's no recognition for that. That is a form of the systemic violence that we're kind of going up against when we're talking about these things. Anyway.
I always think about the viral tweet, the tweet that went viral 3 months ago where it was a maternity book and it had a Black mother and a Black baby.
It was a Black fetus, yeah.
It's a Black fetus and
like,
how it changed some people's like emotions.
And they're like, I've never seen a Black fetus illustrated before.
That's how simple we're talking.
That's where we're starting.
That's where we're starting. Baby's first solidarity.
Yeah. You were
I mean, I just feel like we see that reflected everywhere. Like we do education like through the clinic, and that's something that I do. I have a split role with being executive director, and it's similar to what we get for sex ed in that I can go to like be invited by a teacher and do one grade 9 classroom, and then the rest of those grade 9 students never interact with me and just have to deal with whatever sex ed their teacher is able to like manifest. So I think that's just reflected on a larger level. Like I get called in to do professional development all the time, but it's totally piecemeal. I did like one dental practice here and then one group of residents here, but none of those folks talk to each other.
They brought you in, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, they're not required to do that too, which is part of the problem.
No. Yeah, I mean, it's all those things. I don't have any additional revolutionary thoughts there, except that we then see the consequences of that as service providers getting funneled all into one place, and then we have our capacity issues.
Exactly. Which can't be addressed because you're a boutique clinic. Oh, that's so infuriating.
Yes.
Wow, it all comes down to the control of money.
Yeah.
The control of capital. Who thought?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so we've got time for one more question. It's a little bit difficult to pick one. I feel like we've touched on a lot of them in different ways, but I think one thing that we haven't really talked about is that there's been a lot of, at least in Nova Scotia, which has been amazing, a lot of media coverage lately around gender affirming care, both locally here in Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia, but also kind of more broadly, like how can the media narrative be improved around gender affirming care? Do you feel like there's anything that's not being covered that should be?
I want to talk about an experience I had when you guys put out your statement, and I was contacted by a media organization, and I gave a 30-minute interview about systemic failings, discrimination, and etc. And at the very end, they asked me about my personal experience accessing gender affirming care, and that is the only thing they featured in this news story. which has nothing to do with the conversation we were having. And while it's important to reflect on individual stories, don't invite people to an interview, whether regardless of what your intentions are, and ask them all these questions about systemic discrimination, exclusion under the current system, and then throw that out to say, oh, they've been trying to access gender affirming care since November 2020. That has nothing to do with the conversation we were having. So it is important, and I think a really good example of how to do it right is the article that Victoria Walton put out today that she's been working on since March, where she specifically went out and talked to 3 trans people about their specific experiences, how that's impacted them, and how the system could change. And it comes back to centering our voices. If you are going to do something like that, you're going to contact me as an expert on gender affirming care and a trans advocate, and then throw out all of the content that I provided you for what I thought was going to be a side comment just about my experience with gender affirming care. That's an act of violence against me. You just wasted my time and emotional energy, and then made me, not only that did you make me feel, one, that I was going to get a voice, you ripped that away from me. That's not fair. So if you want to have these conversations, don't focus on the small itty bitty surface level details. It is the media's responsibility, especially the widespread media. And we're talking CBC, we're talking global, we're talking CTV, the biggest audiences in Canada. They have a responsibility to address the systemic failures and not just the surface level details, because they are the ones that are getting the most eyes, and therefore they control the narrative on these issues for the majority of people. And when you have me on TV and you're trying to get people to care about gender affirming care, and you make it sound like I'm just a one trans person complaining about the experience was difficult for me and it's currently difficult for me, then instead of talking about the systemic harm that is being caused to hundreds, if not thousands of people in this province, then you have committed an act of violence against the trans community. And that goes the same thing with houselessness experiences, that goes the same with Black experiences and Indigenous experience and disability experiences. You have a responsibility, and I'm saying this into the camera because I know none of the media is here, you have a responsibility to us, and as a issue of journalistic integrity, to make sure you're actually telling the stories that are happening, instead of sending a bunch of TERFs my way who are going to call me a little bitch baby because the system didn't work for me, when that's not the issue we're discussing. You are then part of the problem.
Yeah. I have a similar reflection. I also had a similar experience with the media. I did an activity in Montreal after the Pulse shooting, where we went, a few friends and I, we had this catharsis moment where we went and picked up a few buckets of rainbow chalk from the dollar store and just wrote out names in the middle of Montreal's village. And I did this interview where I said I wanted to do this activity that would hit people, that would make people realize they were being hit by a ton of bricks, that the people who were targeted in this attack were majoritarily Latinx and Black folks, right? That was my message. And that media cut to, I wanted something that would hit people, I wanted to do something that would hit people like a ton of bricks, period, was how that interview got cut, right? Because it doesn't fit the narrative that is trying to be portrayed. And so I think the idea that we need to be super aware of the media is exhausting. That being said, I think one of the things around the media narrative around improving gender affirming care is one thing. I think I understand the media as a pressure. I think as a pressure on government to do better. I'm concerned that our political climate maybe does not lead to that media attention actually being directed towards government in a meaningful way, especially because what ends up happening is it just through the way that they make things look, they normalizes these TERF narratives and helps them push this idea that it's just trans people who are crying because the system's not going fast enough for them to get their hormones, which is basically the way that the media is showing these issues right now. When what we're trying to point out is that there are systemic barriers that are not being addressed, that must be addressed. And when we try to use the media in that way, it's not recognized. And so I think there's this idea of making sure those systemic issues are covered. The tricky part is you can't explain a systemic issue.
Nope, in the 10-second news clip. There's also the
Sorry,
issue.
I'm just going to continue.
Oh, sorry,
finishing
yeah,
that. That's
sorry.
okay.
Absolutely.
And then I think maybe we should let Abbey go, because
Yeah.
Abbey has
Oh, yeah.
spoken not a lot, and
Oh, yeah.
I'm also conscious
Oh,
of like,
I'm very aware of it,
well,
sorry.
also just like very conscious of the way that like, I do this a lot on panels and as well, I
Yeah.
just want to be hyper aware of like the way that like masculine presenting folks have like a tendency, like men and masculine presenting folks have like this tendency to like occupy space because we feel like it belongs to us. It does not, and you know, just how that like often works to the detriment of like women and like feminine presenting folks. And so anyway, yeah, I think there's just like, if there's anything that's not covered that should be, it's that access. It's that idea of like these systemic barriers and like understanding this as like an issue related to justice and not an individualized issue that's rooted in like the experiences of one person or another and that kind of stuff. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah, our most like recent media connections have been like pretty positive for us, but it's like interesting. I like peruse Twitter, which I try not to do, and I see all of like the horrific TERF action that ended up on your Twitter, and then from our social media, like we didn't get anything except for like positive acts, which is great and great shares, but it's interesting how like that always goes to you. For us, we have to be careful, or like what I try to keep in mind when I'm doing media interviews, that I'm speaking from a place of service provision. I'm not a trans person and I can't pretend to be so, as same with the rest of our staff, for the majority except for some volunteers. And so like I don't mind just like listening to folks on this panel. I always think of the meme that is my most favorite to put in my slideshows of the like talking gender with trans folks versus cis folks, and it's the baby versus like Socrates. I love that one so much. And I think it's important for like us as service providers, until suddenly service providers are all magically trans and have every other identity, that we are the babies. I'm the baby. I have a gender studies degree. I'm still the baby. I work in service provision. I'm the baby. So like, that's okay. And it's okay to kind of be that way. But media definitely tries to like coax it out of you, like trying to make me speak as if I'm a trans person. So I'm always trying to be conscious that that's not who we are. I can only speak to the barriers and how that impacts our practice. So it's if I could like send a message to the media, it's like keep that in mind, I guess, when you ask me questions. But overall, ours is usually pretty positive engagement.
I want to add one just last piece, I'll make it quick. Stop platforming TERFs.
Yeah.
Stop. This is not a debate. This is not a both sides issue. The majority of Canadians, and as much as they like to consider themselves allies and supporters of the trans community. So when you put a trans person on the air and then you give equal time to a TERF, you make it seem like it's a 50-50 issue. You strengthen these movements and you make it seem like the majority of Canadians, the jury's still out, when that is the absolute not true. Stop platforming TERFs. Leave it at that.
Great note to end on.
No TERFs.
All right. Well, thanks so much. We've come to the end of our time, so thank you. I just want to say thank you to Riley and Vincent and Abbey for coming, for spending your evening with us, sharing your knowledge, expertise, experiences. It's truly been an honor just to have this conversation with you and, on a personal level, have relationships with you and have you in my life in different ways. I think that you're all amazing and brilliant and doing such important work. I also want to say thank you to everyone who came here tonight in person, who logged in on the webinar. Thank you for taking 2 hours out of your time to come and listen to us and hear what we have to say. I also want to say thank you to May and Jillian, our lovely interpreters, who I have not seen, but I have full faith have been amazing. Thank you to Carson, who's been rocking it on the webinar. Yeah, and thank you again to MSVU for the space and to CBRC for also making the webinar and the interpreters possible. And it's just really, I find these conversations so energizing. It's so exciting for me to be in a room with other people that are also thinking about these things and talking about these things, because I think that sometimes when we're trying to access services and we're not getting the care that we need and we're not being supported by the structures that exist, moments like these give me hope. To think that we can, as we're talking about that radical imagination, we can think about our world differently. We can set up systems, our healthcare systems of care differently, and we can work towards creating a world where we can truly be supported and affirmed to show up in our whole selves and the complexity of who we are. So thank you for being a part of that conversation tonight. And that's it, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.